Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Saturday, December 9th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Cotton Bowl game against Missouri in 20 days, the game against Michigan in 357 days. Today we're going to be taking a look back at the previous game against Michigan, more sort of using it in terms of some big picture stuff with the Ohio State defense. We're doing that with our good buddy Ross Fulton, the X's and O's guru at BuckeyeHuddle.com. And of course, every time Ross is on the show, we are proudly presented by Jeff Ruby's Steakhouse, proudly offering a nationally acclaimed USDA prime steaks, seafood and sushi, impeccable service, live entertainment, and an attention to detail that is simply unmatched. Just go to jeffruby.com/Columbus to check out the menu and make a reservation today. All right, Ross, we got to talk about the Ohio State defense and what they were doing. And you were talking before the show, and you said they really were doing kind of like one of two things that were kind of very different on defense. One was very aggressive, one was pretty not aggressive. So let's start with the aggressive half of the Ohio State defense. What were they doing? And it seems like at least in this example, it works. So why didn't they do it more?
Yeah. So it was an interesting, in the first quarter, they played a bunch of soft cover four. Then the second quarter, like we're going to show here, they played a pretty aggressive cover one where you're playing cover one over, corners are falling, receivers, you're chasing motion. And then they went back to the soft cover four. And so it was one of two things. So as you said, this is an example of the more aggressive posture, right? So you got motion here to the flat. You have Denzel Burke chasing the motion. So, you have everyone up on their man. Michigan does run mesh here, which is a cover one beater, but no one gets open. And Mike Hall makes a sack, which is essentially maybe the one negative play Ohio State created during this game. And so I think in theory, and Michigan obviously expected a lot of man coverage from Ohio State. You could see in some of their concepts early, and they weren't getting it. I think in theory, I would have argued that this was probably how Ohio State was most effective against Michigan, with this more aggressive cover one, gap everything out. The problem was, I do understand, and it makes total sense why you can't do this every play. We saw the problems when Kerry Combs was here, why you can't do this every play. Teams start motioning you to death. This is sort of a light version of this. You saw one play, where Michigan yo-yoed Jordan Hancock with Donovan Edwards, and he was chasing him back and forth and back and forth. It reminded me of the Alabama touchdown on the national championship game, or Michigan in response to this kind of cover one brought in their backup quarterback to run Wildcat. They ran the counter tray bash, and they sent a guy in motion, and so Ohio State followed, and they had no force defender. So it makes sense why Ohio State and Jim Knowles was mixing cover one with something. The interesting thing just is we can get into here is the fact that they were playing cover four at all, because it was just I would say the first 2 months of the year, they rarely if ever played cover four. And then starting with Rutgers, it really became more and more part of their system, and not an aggressive cover four, country or really soft cover four. And whether that was, it's hard to cause and effect here. Whether it was starting with Rutgers, they started playing some teams, and Michigan falls in this category of a quarterback who could run read plays in theory or design runs and hurt you, and you want to have the safeties available to help against the run. Or it was because of the loss of Latham Ransom and having to move Sonny Styles to boundary safety, and whether you want to keep things more simple because of the loss of that experience, or, Sonny Styles is 230 pounds. It limits what you can do coverage wise. I just don't know the answer to that. Probably maybe some combination thereof, but as we can see in these next two plays, then the problem was the way they were running cover four gave Michigan some openings.
All right, well then let's go straight to that, because we're talking about that sort of soft cover four coverage. How does this leave openings for Michigan to do what they want to do?
Yeah, and so this is gets into some of my frustration going on multiple years now with the Ohio State defense, and just the kind of overly simplistic schemes that they continue to run. And so, when Ohio State was playing this cover four, they were just basically lining up to the field, and no matter how Michigan aligned, they didn't adjust. And so, so first, we'll start. That hurt Ohio State two ways. It hurt them with the passing game to the field with the tight end, and then the run game to the boundary. So we start with the passing game, right? And so we have, because you're not adjusting, like particularly you have here only three underneath defenders, right? You're playing cover four, like a soft cover four. So you have a lot of room to cover underneath. And then Michigan motions, and so they have trips to the field. They know that Ohio State's not in cover one, by the way, as we discussed. Like, they weren't chasing the motion. Jordan Hancock stays away. So now, instead of like flipping your scheme or shifting your coverage, you now have Jordan Hancock here to the backside with no one to cover, right? I guess a theory of back out of the backfield could come to that side. And now you have your two linebackers who are now pushed out of the box and responsible for these underneath routes here to the passing strength. And, Michigan runs just a little stick route. Obviously, it's exacerbated by Eichenberg missing the tackle. But again, like, there's ways to deal with this. Like, if you want to run cover four, you can sort of spin your cover four to the field. You can run poach coverage with the backside safety. There's cover four is designed to deal with trips and changes of formations. It just, like, again, they just were sort of very conservative in how they did this, to the point that it was pretty easy to exploit.
And Michigan was able to exploit it not just in the pass game, but also in the run game. This next one is I believe this is the Blake Corum touchdown, right? The next one we're going to be talking about,
yes.
the long Blake Corum touchdown. Yeah, I mean, this is one where Michigan. It felt like all day Michigan was just kind of like 3 yards, 4 yards, 2 yards, and all of a sudden, like, boom, they pop a long one right after the Zach Zinter injury too for a touchdown. So what went wrong for Ohio State on this one?
Yeah, and this is sort of like the weird dynamic of this game is you can argue it both ways, right? I mean, Ohio State did, with its strategy, largely limit Michigan to sort of dink and dunking down the field and force them to string drives together. And Michigan's explosive plays generally came out of, like, they ran the couple trick plays or missed tackles, which didn't happen all that often. So it's a perfectly reasonable to argue that, like, this strategy was enough for Ohio State to win this game. And, but for, again, like, the early interception that put them on the 8-ball. But on the flip side, like, I just, from a scheme perspective, I find it frustrating, just like making things harder on yourself than you need to. So, like, yeah, you get to this play again. So Michigan comes out and they have 12 personnel, or actually 21. They have a fullback. And so, like, Ohio State responded to this a lot with a 4-3 with Cody Simon. Again, like, this might have been a artifact of Latham Ransom's injury, because you have to play Siles as a deep safety. But, like, whenever Michigan got Simon in the game, they would just do this, which is like, okay, we know you want to put your 4-3 to the field. And so we're going to put, like, twins or trips to the field and a nub tight end or a run strength to the boundary. And all that would do is just pull Simon out in the flat. So now he basically has to play way out in space. And now you have a cornerback to the boundary responsible for the backside C gap, taking on an offensive tackle. And so, again, you're just like, those are not the matchups you want. So, like, they exploited it by throwing some at Simon or running it away from him. And again, so, like, here, they run this isolation play. And so Chambers has to fill to that side because you're creating an extra gap. So he has to fill to the field. And again, you have Davison Igbinosun taking on an offensive tackle to play the C gap. It's not the cause of this play being a big run, but it certainly doesn't help. And, like, Ohio State was fortunate that its corners were pretty physical and could do this kind of stuff. But you have Styles filling from depth. He hadn't played a ton back there. He had some struggles doing this. He misses the tackle. So that exacerbates the issue. But, like, again, there's just easier ways to do this, right? So, like, you could bump JT TomOrrow inside instead of having him super wide outside the tight end, and at least get Igbinosun out of playing an interior run gap. You could spin your coverage to the field, such that, like, if you want to still run cover four, you basically bump everyone over. So, like, Proctor gets over the slot, Styles pushes to where Proctor is. Igbinosun now becomes essentially like a deep quarters player to that side, and now you can bump your linebackers back, or like you run two steel like Michigan did is another example of like essentially all they're doing with that, where we talked about, is like bumping the coverage to the field where the passing strength is, so you have more run defenders to the boundary. And so again, like this didn't kill them throughout the game, but it's sort of frustrating because it's just not it's not best practices, right? And so I think this just again gets to like, we did not see Jim Knowles do this at Oklahoma State, and it's just still like sort of just pretty simplistic. So like whether this is just a result of like the clash between Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson, in terms of like Larry Johnson wanting to play 4 down and have every defensive lineman have one gap, and so now you got to fill gaps with DBs, and it just limits what you can do. I don't know the answer, but I just still think that it's holding them back on defense.
Well, you mentioned how they were broadly successful in forcing Michigan dink and dunk down the field with that kind of more conservative approach. The problem was that Michigan was able to dink and dunk down the field, and they didn't force any punts in the second half. Michigan scored on every drive in the second half, other than the kneel down at the end of the game. So, I think there were a lot of people wondering, when are they going to get more aggressive? And they did get more aggressive eventually, but this play comes at the 2:07 mark of the fourth quarter, which was pretty darn late in the football game, where they finally do get aggressive and get some good results. So how did they get more aggressive here? And, was it too late at that point? He asked leadingly.
Yeah, I mean, that's partially why I've included this, to show that A, like there are things they could have done, and B, I think even with their even if you want to argue that their strategy was the right one because it limited Michigan to getting big plays. Again, like I even question that, because Michigan has not been an explosive offense this year. I'm not quite sure what they were so concerned about. And my opinion, especially even after watching J.J. McCarthy against Iowa as well, is like he's pretty good if you just like give him those easy like flat completions or like tight end stick routes. If you force him to like go through his reads downfield, that's where he can make mistakes. And we saw that as well when Ohio State ran some cover one. So again, like you can't just run cover one every play. I'm not sure why their only option was like to run this cover 4, but like even putting that aside, the last drive, like you just can't sit back. And they finally here stepped up and brought like a C gap Cody Simon blitz and slanted their defensive line and made a stop. It's just unfortunate that it took that long, because now Michigan was in field goal range. You've had 5 minutes run off the clock. So I think if a strategy that even so would have probably even made more sense if Ohio State ever got a lead. It's a little too late. And I just still think it makes you wondering, like, what does Jim Knowles want to do on defense? Again, we saw like quite a change this year from like playing a bunch of cover 1 with some cover 2 mixed in. And then like there's no cover 2 against Michigan. All of a sudden they're playing a bunch of cover 4. And it was just kind of an interesting path they took while playing very good defense throughout the year. But I just still think that, like, again, there's some tools in the toolbox that are still missing that are going to hold them back from being a really, for as good as they were like SP plus on defense, they never could really impose themselves, right? Like it was more like we'll give up a couple drives and then we'll like tighten the screws down a little bit, or like the opponent will make a mistake. It was never sort of like we can assert ourselves. And I think these are part of the reasons, like that's what they still need, is more tools to be able to do that, and some balance between uber aggressiveness and being passive, And again, that goes back to more creepers, more fire zones, like ways to bring some pressure without selling out.
Well, if you want to talk more about this and any of the stuff we talked about on today's show, or any of the other stuff Ross has talked about in previous weeks, a great place to do that would be on the Huddle board presented by Jeff Ruby at BuckeyeHuddle.com. It is a members-only board where we have lots of schematic talk. Devin and Mickey and Ross answer lots, and Justin answer lots and lots of questions for you. There are whole threads just about. We'll put up a thread with this video with some of the video clips from the games. You can actually see what we're talking about, and then those guys will be answering questions and making you a smarter football fan. All that is exclusive to Buckeye Huddle members at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Of course, you can also find all of our stuff at YouTube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. And you can make sure you're subscribed there. Hit that bell. Leave us a thumbs up on these videos if you're watching them and enjoying them. That helps other folks find these shows. And if you'd like to listen on the podcast, on your podcast platform of choice, search Buckeye Huddle wherever you're getting your podcast. You can find all of our great shows. We would appreciate a 5-star rating and review there as well. That helps other folks find these shows. We would appreciate that. We also appreciate our friends at Jeff Ruby's Steakhouse, the award-winning upscale steakhouse in downtown Columbus, named one of the top 50 steakhouses in America by Food Network. Just go to jeffruby.com/Columbus, check out the menu, and make your reservations today. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.